So, Anil, your central thesis is that consciousness is a kind of hallucination or a controlled hallucination. Can you walk us through that?
It's really a way of trying to understand why our conscious experiences have the character that they do. Why does a visual experience feel like a visual experience? Why does an emotional experience feel like an emotional experience? And it it's sort of built on a more general framework or theory about how brains do what they do. And the basic idea is very simple. If we think of perception as this problem that the brain faces of trying to figure out what's going on in the world, um, it feels like
Hmm.
we just have direct access to that. You open your eyes and a world appears. There it is, as if the world just pours itself into our minds through the transparent windows of our eyes and our ears. But that can't really be what's going on. If you think about things from the perspective of a brain, it's dark inside the skull, it's silent, there's no sound, there's no light. All the brain has to go on are these electrical signals coming from the senses, transductions of light energy or sound energy. And out of those unlabeled and ambiguous and noisy electrical impulses, the brain is able to create this world um, that we experience, and also the self within that
Mm.
world. How does it do that? How on earth does that happen? And this is just an amazing thing. And the theory that you can trace it back to Plato or Immanuel Kant or Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century, Chris Frith, more recently, is that the brain is basically making a best guess about the causes of its sensory signals. So it's doing what, in theory terms, we might call Bayesian inference. It's trying to figure out what it should believe about the state of the world, given its already existing beliefs um, and sensory input. And the way it does this, so the theory goes, is by always generating predictions about what's going on out there, and ultimately predictions about the sensory data that's coming into the eyes,
Mm.
and then using the sensory data not to sort of read out the world, but to update the predictions. So the brain in this view is constantly engaged in this dance of predicting, updating, um, so that its best guesses, its predictions, are controlled by sort of track reality in some way, in some useful way, some way that helps us survive. And why? And so theory, this is interesting because if brains do this, then this is actually a way for them to solve this problem of Bayesian inference, to actually make a best guess about what's going on out there in the world. So it makes sense from that point of view. From the perspective of consciousness, the sort of claim that rise on top of that, which is sort of where I got into the game, is saying, look, what we experience is the content of the prediction. It's not a readout of the sensory signals. And this is kind of counterintuitive because it suggests that what we experience, even though it feels like it comes from the outside in, the world is there and we kind of receive it passively and there it is. It's active. It comes from the inside out, the top down. And sensory data is there to control, to calibrate, our top down best guesses. So this is why the slogan
Mm.
controlled hallucination is useful, because when we think of hallucination, we typically think of a sort of internally generated experience that's sort of not reflected in reality. But a controlled hallucination is still an internally generated experience, but one that is now controlled by, calibrated by reality. So it's not arbitrary. I'm not saying the real world doesn't exist or any, not at all. The real world exists, and our perceptual experiences generally track it, but they don't reveal it as it is. They reveal it as we
Mm.
are and as it is useful for our survival and behavior. So that's the core idea. And then what I when you pull on this thread long enough, and this is really the story in the book, Being You, is that you can start by thinking about this, how we perceive the world, and colors don't really exist objectively out there. There are brains inferences about how light reflects off surfaces, and then you bit by bit just sort of keep pulling on that thread and realize that perhaps fundamental aspects of our experience, like time and space, are also kinds of inferences. They don't necessarily reflect reality as it is. And then the self is also part of the same story, that the self is not the thing that does the perceiving, but the self is another kind of inference the brain is making. The brain is, inferring the causes now of sensory signals that come from the body, like that come from muscle movements and that come from the interior of the body too, the heart, the lungs, the gut, um, the muscles. And at that point, you sort of realize actually this whole business of prediction is not just about figuring out what's out there. It's actually a very useful way of controlling things. When you can predict, you can control. And that again shifts the view of what brains are fundamentally for. Maybe they're not for perceiving the world or for having complex thoughts. They're for controlling and regulating the body, for keeping the body alive, keeping heart rate, blood pressure, blood oxygenation, all of these physiological quantities within the tight bounds that are compatible with survival. So in my view, our ability to perceive the world is kind of built on top of or parasitical on this more fundamental duty of brains, which is to keep the living system going. And back to this whole point about AI, this imperative for control and regulation, it's not sort of interrupted at some mindware, wetware, sharp divide. It goes down all the way through, and here it becomes a bit more, this is perhaps the more speculative part, down into the level of metabolism. So it's really, this the brain as a prediction machine is deeply entangled with things that we might think of as definitional of life. And so in this view, the brain as a prediction machine, consciousness as a controlled hallucination becomes very deeply entangled with the fact that we are, living creatures that continually persist from moment to moment, that regenerate their own components, that reinforce the boundary between the organism and the environment in ways which non-living systems just do not.